This is the BBC with a public broadcast. It's a new day, and the sun rises yet again in Europe. Across our glorious continent and country, men and women go about their daily lives, providing for their families and their nation. This peaceful order, tranquility, and prosperity across Europe is here, all thanks to the glorious German Empire. Since their rightful victory in the Weltkrieg in 1918, and during the awful times of the Great Depression, the Germans have supplied their plentiful bounty of resources and wealth across the continent and the world, and have taken care of our remaining colonies in Africa and Oceania. One would argue that it's a great time to be alive, with employment and happiness at its all-time high. Once again, we thank the German Empire for bringing about a new Europe, a more peaceful and a more powerful Europe. Liebe Deutschland. The First World War, the Great War, the War to End All Wars, the Weltkrieg, the 1914 War, no matter what you call it, World War I was a massive defining moment that shaped the way the rest of the 20th century would play out, lasting for roughly 4 years with Britain, France, Russia, and America, also known as the Entente, going against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, the Central Powers. The war ended in an Entente victory, however many people have speculated what would have happened if the war went the other way. That's what I'll be covering in today's video. What if the Central Powers won World War I? But before we can talk about what didn't happen, we first have to briefly look at what did. Let's start at the very beginning. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars, a wave of pan-German nationalism broke out across Prussia and the other German kingdoms. Long story short, it led to the unification of the German states in the mid-19th century, creating the German Empire. The German Empire was new on the European playing field compared to other empires like that of Britain, France, and Russia. Germany still managed to get included in the scramble for Africa and gained quite a bit of land outside the continent. In the lead-up to World War I, Germany, just like most of the other European powers at the time, began heavily modernizing their military. This became this, this became this, this became this, and this became this. This modernization scared Britain and France. This would eventually lead to a rivalry building up between the two sides. At the turn of the 20th century, it was becoming clear that a war was on the horizon. Eventually, Germany won their chance to demonstrate their new capabilities after the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand got shot by a Serbian nationalist in the city of Sarajevo in June of 1914. This enraged Austria-Hungary, who was allies with Germany, causing both of them to declare war on Serbia. This enraged Russia, who was allied with Serbia, so Russia declared war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. France was also allied with Russia and also declared war on Germany. This all caused Germany to come up with the Schlieffen Plan. While Russia was preparing for war, Germany planned to storm through France and then move all their troops east and invade Russia and win the war. At first, Britain didn't want to get involved in the conflict. That was until Germany invaded Belgium to get to France and avoid getting across the heavily fortified Franco-German border. This enraged Britain, who declared war on Germany. The First World War was also one of the first conflicts to introduce trench warfare. This form of warfare greatly slowed any progress that was happening in the war and often made life hell for the soldiers who were fighting on the Western Front. Unrestricted submarine warfare was also used during the war, and Germany especially used U-boats and underwater mines to hit and sink enemy navy and civilian ships. Examples of such ships was the British ship the Lusitania, which was carrying many American passengers on board. During the war, Germany also sent out the Zimmermann telegram to Mexico requesting that it declare war and invade the United States. However, the telegram was intercepted by the Brits and given to the Americans. All of this, combined with the news that Germany was committing atrocities in Belgium, angered the US, who declared war on Germany. Oh, for goodness sake. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire had also joined the war on Germany's side against the British, the Russians, and the Arabs, and in East Asia, Japan joined the Entente, taking over German colonies in China and the Pacific. Russia eventually pulled out of the war after a communist revolution that might have been encouraged by the Germans took place under the lead of socialist revolutionary Vladimir Lenin in 1917 to 1918, ending hundreds of years of Tsarist rule in Russia and establishing the Soviet Union. After many hard-fought campaigns, the Ottomans would be defeated, causing their empire to finally collapse and their territory divided up among the Allies. Then, the US finally got included in the war alongside the Entente. The German Empire, on the brink of defeat, collapsed in 1918 and was replaced by a parliamentary republic, and eventually, at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November 1918, a ceasefire was signed, ending the war in an Entente victory. The following Treaty of Versailles was very harsh on the Central Powers. The Ottomans, now just Turkey, had to give up lots of lands to the Arabs, Brits, and the French, and Austria had to give Bosnia, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia independence. Germany was the hardest hit. The Kaiser was exiled, they had to demilitarize the Rhineland, reduce their army, give up their Pacific colonies to Japan, and give some land to a new nation that was formed to its east called Poland. On top of that, Germany had to pay massive amounts of war reparations to the Entente in the form of money that they did not have. All of this caused the German economy to come crashing down as they printed more money to pay their reparations. And the new Weimar government that had been installed was not helping the situation. So when a far right-wing leader by the name of Adolf Hitler took control in Germany in 1932, he promised to restore the country to its former glory. This led to the establishment of the Third Nazi German Reich, an authoritarian fascist dictatorship that believed heavily in the eradication of all non-Aryan people. This included Jews, Gypsies, gays, and many more. With the idea of new living space for the Germans in his head, Hitler annexed Austria and invaded Germany's neighboring countries. This started a Second World War that Germany lost again, and the nation was divided into 4 Allied occupied zones for good measure, beginning the almost half-century-long Cold War between the US and the USSR, and beginning of the nuclear age, leading to the world we know and live in today. But what if that was different? What if in an alternate timeline, the Germans and the Central Powers won World War I and the Entente lost? First of all, before we discuss what would have happened if the Central Powers won, we need to discuss how the Central Powers would have won. Because this is a very popular scenario, there are many points of divergence, from what if the Germans carried out the Schlieffen Plan, what if Italy never switched sides, what if Britain never got involved, which is in fact a video I've already covered, and what if Britain or the US joined the Central Powers. But one of the more popular points of divergence, and in fact the one I think is the most valid, is what if the US never got involved? For the sake of keeping this part short, I'm just going to assume that that is the reason. And also for the sake of making this a bit more entertaining, I'm going to narrate this scenario as if it was canon, so here goes. On June 28, 1914, the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by Serbian nationalists in Sarajevo. The Austro-Hungarian government was outraged and declared war on Serbia, thus beginning World War I. Soon, Russia, an ally of Serbia, declared war on Austro-Hungary, while Germany declared war on Russia and France. To end the war quickly, Germany attempted to carry out the Schlieffen Plan, which failed, causing the Germans to attack Belgium. The UK then declared war on Germany. In France, trench warfare was introduced to stop the Germans from reaching Paris. In 1915, a German U-boat sank the British civilian ship the Lusitania, which was carrying weapons and a lot of American passengers. This began to stir up some anti-German sentiment in the US. Later on in the war, Germany also sent out the Zimmermann telegram to Mexico to request that they attack the USA. Mexico received the telegram but declined it, not wanting to waste their men. In the following years, the US became increasingly isolationist so as to not get involved with the war as the Triple Entente began to fail against the Germans. In Arabia, the British suffered embarrassing defeats in Gallipoli at the hands of the Ottomans. However, the Turks were still struggling to push back the Arab revolt. Furthermore, Russia had a communist revolution led by Vladimir Lenin, causing Russia to pull out of the war. Eventually, the strain became too much for the Entente. The Germans had broken their lines and were now reaching the French capital of Paris, and at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918, an armistice was signed, and World War I ended in a Central Powers victory. The following Treaty of Potsdam was very harsh on the Entente. Both France and Britain had to pay war reparations to the Germans and also had to hand some of their overseas colonies to them. Britain also had to give Ireland its independence. Austria-Hungary completely annexed Serbia and Montenegro and also gained land in North Italy, further stirring up anti-Austrian sentiment in the country. The Ottomans would gain Greece as a puppet state, however they still weren't able to crush the Arabs during the war, causing them to eventually relent and give them independence as a united Arab nation in the Middle East. The nation of Bulgaria also gained some land. Germany annexed Belgium and placed some lands in North France under military occupation. Denmark and the Netherlands would become somewhat German puppets. Russia, in accordance with the Brest-Litovsk Treaty that was signed earlier, had to give lots of its western territory independence as German puppets. Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and even Romania all came under Berlin's influence. Finland would also gain its independence. As for the rest of Russia, the revolution had turned into a civil war between the White Army and the Red Communists. Even though the Germans supported Lenin in the revolution, they only did it to bring Russia out of the war. Now the tables had turned. The Germans, viewing the Reds as a threat, supported the White Army, who eventually won the Civil War. The Bolsheviks were dissolved and Lenin was executed. The rest of the members of his party either killed themselves or went into hiding. With the Whites winning the war, a democratic government came to power in Russia, founding the Russian Republic. With the war over, a new world had been built. Now time to explain the events after the treaty. The 1920s was a very prosperous time for the Germans. Thanks to their victory in the war and the reparations from the Entente, their economy was booming. In Africa, the Germans had merged their newly gained colonies into one massive super colony known as Middle Africa. The United States was also going through similar economic advancement, however in many places across the country, unemployment was on the rise. Due to them being cancelled during the war and because of the fact that Germany won, the 1920 Olympic Games were held in Berlin. Meanwhile, in southern Europe, Austria-Hungary was failing. Despite them also winning the war, they were experiencing lots of political and ethnic division, and by 1922, all plans for a potential United States of Austria had completely gone down the toilet. Furthermore, Italy was on a massive anti-Austria spree, with Italians considering the Austrians as greedy land thieves. Soon, even Hungary was fed up with Austria, and in 1923, they gained independence, along with Serbia, Bosnia, Montenegro, and Bohemia, and Austria-Hungary was no more. With the dissolution of Austria-Hungary, Germany saw some major opportunities, and soon Czechoslovakia was absorbed into Germany's sphere of influence. In France, the economy had completely gone out the window. Unemployment and poverty was everywhere thanks to the Treaty of Potsdam. As a result, the French people were pissed, and so the French people did what French people do best. They rioted. A series of protests and revolts broke out across France, and the people began to get really polarized. On one hand, the French nationalists promised to restore France to its former imperial glory, and of course, get revenge on and destroy Germany. And on the other hand, the French socialists who wanted to unite the French people and bring prosperity to France. Eventually, after an extremely messy yet brief Fourth French Revolution in 1925, the French socialists seized control and declared the People's Republic of France. This kind of polarization was appearing in Italy as well. The loss of their land was creating political tension within the nation. That, as well as a bad economy, weak government, and their loss in World War I, led a nationalist political figure called Benito Mussolini to lead a fascist coup against the king, leading him to be installed in power in Italy. This didn't sit well with the Italian socialists and anti-fascists, who viewed Mussolini's idea of a new Roman Empire as dangerous and far-fetched. This in turn caused Italy to become even more factionalized and politically divided. In 1928, the socialists in the north declared independence and founded the Italian People's Republic. Then, in 1929, things took a turn for the worst, with the Wall Street stock market crash, causing the US economy and eventually the world's economy to come crashing down. This had an especially crippling effect on France, which until this point had been experiencing economic problems, instability, and the beginning of a famine in the countryside. Jeez. The 1930s was very tumultuous. During the events of the Great Depression, unemployment skyrocketed in the US, and inflation rates began rising across the globe. The German Empire was one of the less affected countries, however, was still hit nonetheless. Meanwhile, France began to purge many of its political leaders and citizens in the beginning of what would today be known as the Great French Purge of 1933. In the US, unemployment continued to rise dramatically and, you guessed it, people started taking sides because of it. In the Great Lakes region and the South, the American syndicalists, socialists, totalists, and leftists began demonstrating and protesting, demanding a solution to the issue of unemployment and the bad economy. Some individuals were even demanding secessions from the US. Many Christians and nationalists also took the chance to gain some political power. Furthermore, many European countries, particularly the UK, began getting really protective and paranoid about their overseas colonies, fearing that they would be stolen by the Imperial German menace, and many countries' governments began growing distrust for one another. Then, in 1935, the Spanish Civil War began between the Spanish Republicans and the Nationalists. Immediately, the European powers took sides. The French, Brits, and Northern Italians sided with the Republicans, while the Germans and Southern Italians began siding with the Nationalists. The United States, as usual, whimpered into isolationism, didn't take any sides, and kept quiet. Every country was suddenly angry again. The British and the French were extremely resentful towards the Germans, and both wanted some form of revenge. The South Italians wanted to reunite Italy and turn it into a world power. The Russians, although formerly having no beef with the Germans, were also resentful towards the new order and wanted to topple it, and the Ottoman Empire was suffering economically and was at risk of falling again, with Greece wanting to break free from its sphere of influence. There was even an economic rivalry between the Japanese and the Germans in the Pacific. And what remained of Austria was also becoming increasingly dependent on Germany for economic help. Everyone thought that a new war could solve their problems, and this is the beginning of the world's dark descent into the Second World War.